Greetings. Hello, everyone. And Pankaj, thank you so much for inviting me to join your conference. And I'm very happy to record a statement on Sanskrit Buddhism. I decided to give the title. And I'm here in my home in the Catskills. I'm an emeritus professor at Columbia. You may have already introduced me. And I'm a Padma Shri from the year 2020, which I'm very, very honored by, and from the President of India. And I'm very sad about the current situation in your land, which I feel is sort of like my second homeland, just informally. And I went there first in 1962, and I've always had a strong feeling about Mother India, about Mahabharata. So anyway, the term Sanskrit Buddhism is a term of His Holiness the Dalai Lama's as a way of distinguishing Indian Mahayana Buddhism and Tibetan Mahayana Buddhism from the Theravada Buddhism of Sri Lanka and of India also, which was in the Pali language. The scriptures are in the Pali language, which is theory is that it's derived, as many of you probably know, from the Ardha Magadhi spoken dialect. I'm talking to you today. Thank you very much for inviting me. Thanks to Pankaj especially for inviting me. And I'm very happy to share with you the Sanskrit Buddhism. It's a brief talk on what I call Sanskrit Buddhism. And in calling that Mahayana, Indian Mahayana Buddhism, Sanskrit Buddhism, I am following the usage of His Holiness the Dalai Lama, who refers to Mahayana Indian Buddhism like that to distinguish it from Nikaya Buddhism or Theravada Buddhism or Mahasangika Buddhism, basically what I call individual vehicle Buddhism, and Mahayana I call universal vehicle Buddhism. So the Sanskrit Buddhism refers to that. And the Mahayana literature itself is subdivided in the Indian and Tibetan traditions into what's called the Paramita Yana, or exoteric Mahayana, and then the Vajrayana or Tantrayana, which is the esoteric Mahayana. Although it's called Yana, it's not really it's part of the Mahayana, just the esoteric part of it, in the way they understand it. And the main body of Sanskrit Buddhism, unfortunately, the literature or scripture of Sanskrit Buddhism, is not any longer in Sanskrit, unfortunately. It's in these books behind me, which are part of them, which is an edition of the Tibetan long page book of about 5,000 volumes, or works, actually, maybe 300 and some volumes, usually, in Tibetan woodblock printing nowadays, which are translations into Tibetan, very, very sort of accurate translations, because the Tibetan language was created in order to have make those translations. So it's very close in grammar and everything to Sanskrit. And although the words are different, but they very much fit with specific Sanskrit according to a concordance or various concordances that the Sanskrit pundits and Tibetan translators who worked together for about 4 centuries to translate the literature of the Nalanda University Library, Vikramashila, Vallabhi, etc., many different Indian Buddhist monastic universities that existed in India in the classical period. And so that's the main version. About 10% of that volume of literature we have found, and occasionally they pop up more, around 10 to 15% of that literature. We find a Sanskrit manuscript, perhaps from Nepal or from Tibet, or from some library, a Jain library, perhaps in India or somewhere. Occasionally a new one gets discovered. And great Indian professors in the 19th and 20th centuries did a lot of work people like um, uh, Jayaswal, the Jayaswal Institute in Patna, and other places. They brought back some from Tibet. But it's anyway huge literature. It's kind of a lost literature for Sanskrit, and it has been my pleasure and privilege to work with that literature and help create it. The Indian government and institutions such as the Central Institute of Higher Tibetan Studies, founded 30, 40, 50 years ago, they slowly were translating back into Sanskrit some of the important works at a rather slow pace, but they did some of them. And nowadays, that's the Central University of Tibetan Studies. They still continue that and publish works in their journal and so on. And and there are various movements afoot in Patna and perhaps in Andhra Pradesh to try to really implement this where it happens more rapidly. The Dalai Lama, when I first got my PhD in the early 1970s, he urged me to found some sort of institution to try to finish the job in bringing this all back to India into the Sanskrit language by 3 generations, he said. When he first said, you have to do that, I thought that was unreasonable. And he said, well, of course, you won't finish in your lifetime, but 3 generations, if you make an institution, perhaps it will work. Now, the question may be that since India has been getting along okay for 800 years or so, since the burning of Nalanda in 1172 of the Common Era, what's the relevance of this collection of the treasures of its lost library? Well, it had 3 major libraries. Actually, Nalanda did one called Ratnodadi, one called Ratnasagara, and one called Ratnaranjaka. Basically, considering these scriptures to be jewels, they had, and I'm sure many more than the 5,000 works that are incorporated in Tibet, in the Tibetan translations. But the Tibetan translations are perhaps some of the most important ones in the curriculum of Nalanda University, which therefore would be the ones that the Panditas and the Lodzawas, which is Tibetan from Loka Chakchuhu, in the eye of the world. The name of a translator in Tibetan, Lodzawa, comes from the Sanskrit Loka Chakchuhu. And so the 9-story tall Ratnodadi library, the mountain of whose palm leaf manuscripts took something like 6 months to burn fully when the gentleman, the military army burned it in 1172. Here I refer to the distinguished Agra University. Now, just to answer that question of what's the relevance of the collection for Indian civilization's self-understanding, scholarly-wise, and here let me mute that in case any more emails are out. Here I refer to a wonderful thing I discovered years and years ago. The distinguished Agra University scholar, philosopher, who incidentally was the grandfather of our beloved late Kapila Vatsyayana, who many of you some may know, who sadly but recently passed away. His name Dharmendra Nath Shastri, wonderful scholar, and he wrote a book which was very helpful to me personally in my studies in the old days, called Critique of Indian Realism, a masterful study of the Nyaya Vaisheshika systems from the Sutrakaras in the 4th century before the Common Era, all the way to the great Udayana of the Navya Nyaya, very, very late, very, very late. And in his dedicatory Parampara, he has a name that is very hard to spell in Sanskrit, Sherbatsky, Theodore, or he just says Sherbatskaya. He puts it in the dative case in Sanskrit because he's going Namaha, in his Parampara, and writing in Devanagari script. And that's STCH, that B, and then TSK. So that kind of consonant cluster is hard to write in Sanskrit. So when I first saw it, I thought, what is that? What kind of Indian name is that? and but it's a Russian name, of course. And he was a great Russian scholar of the late 19th, early 20th centuries. And he wrote a famous book in English called Buddhist Logic, 2 volumes, which for the first time introduced to modern European philosophers and Indian and English reading philosophers the great works of Dignaga and Dharmakirti in the 5th and 6th centuries. And others, there are quite a number of other such writers. These were residents of Nalanda Monastic University. And they were great logicians and epistemologists, and very seminal ones. And Professor Shastri, then in his introduction, preface, he tells the story of how his work, the works of Dignaga and Dharmakirti, as introduced to him by the Russian scholar, initially in English, Sherbatsky, although some of their works do still exist in Sanskrit. Pramanavartika of Dharmakirti is very well known, and Pramana Samuchaya is well known in, although it's not maybe complete, the Sanskrit manuscript of Pramana Samuchaya, but Pramanavartika is. And so he was able to read those texts, of course, but that were introduced to him by Sherbatsky in English. And anyway, he tells the story of how it was like a golden key that he used to unlock the door of mystery, what he was mystified about, which revealed the connection between the 4th century before the Common Era Suttakaras, Akshapada, and Udyotakara of the Vaisheshika Sutra and the Nyaya Sutra, and then connecting it to the great commentators such as Prashastapada, Udyotakara, and so on, who are many, many centuries later, almost 1,000 years later, actually, 6th century of the Common Era. And then Prashastapada and Udyotakara are debating arguments that he didn't know how to decipher, because he didn't know who they were debating with in their commentaries of the Suttakara. And he said that it wasn't until through Sherbatsky he discovered the Buddhist logicians and the Buddhist epistemologists and the Buddhist realists, you could say, especially Dignaga and Dharmakirti, somewhat also Vasubandhu Asanga, who in the 5th century, and Vasubandhu was perhaps the grand teacher of Dignaga. And so he writes about them thanking Sherbatsky for introducing that. And he mentions, actually, he takes the trouble in that preface to mention that before he found that, he was really having a problem. And he went to the Sanskrit Vidyalayas in Banaras, Varanasi, in Calcutta, in Mumbai, wherever he found great pundits. And he tried to query them about this gap of 1,000-year gap, really, between Suttakaras and the great commentary Shastra writers, and no one could really solve the problem for him, because the greatest pundits themselves did not at that time know the work of the Buddhist scholars, because although there were Sanskrit manuscripts of some of their major works, maybe not all of their works, they were not well known, they were not well studied, and it was, since they were Buddhists and Buddhists were gone, they didn't know about them. So it's a marvelous, I loved it myself. I took it to my Sanskrit professor at Harvard, who was wondering why I was so interested in Buddhism and also in Sanskrit, and he thought maybe I should switch to study the Puranas or something. And the Vedas, particularly, he thought I would enjoy the Vedas, and I did enjoy them. But I'm interested in Sanskrit Buddhism, obviously. So another clue comes from another American scholar named Walter Eugene Clark, who was Professor Ingalls, my guru, Sanskrit guru at Harvard. He was his teacher up through the 40s. And he actually was the president of the American Oriental Society in the year 1947. And he gave a presidential address. And I couldn't find my old copy of that, and I couldn't find it online. but it was a very signal, important document in American and European um, Indian studies. And in his presidential address to the assembled Sanskritists, he said that the most important task for the next generation, including his student, Professor Ingalls, was to learn Tibetan and to study the Indian Shastras that no longer can be found in Sanskrit and in Tibetan, and hopefully translate some of them back. And in every stream, in the Vedanta stream of the Darshanas, for example, also in poetics, kavya and things, in every stream of Indian classical civilization, there's this gap between seminal events that happen around Buddha's time, Upanishadic time, the reign of the Takshila, the great Takshila monastery, university in northwest India at that time, northwest Bharata at that time, um, and then there's a long gap in all of the different strands, of the darshanas and so on, where before major commentarial and debate and things come up, and when the debates do come up, the big debatant, the other side, the opposition party, so to speak, are the Buddhists often. There's an intra darshana debates, of course, as well, and debates between different Vedantic commentators and so on, but about the way of interpreting Brahma Sutra and whatever it is. But basically, between the basic sutras and the elaborated people, there's this big gap. And what is the gap, according to Clark's researchers at the time? It is that the great Brahmin scholars and some and great scholars from other castes during that long period were mostly in Buddhist monastic universities or engaged in Buddhist things, because the Indian kings were not supporting big academies kind of thing. And the Buddhist Sangha was a major, as from the time of Ashoka on especially, was a major institution. And that's where the sort of university sort of style type, pluralistic, multi-class or multi-caste education, minds were gathering, and they were writing in the veins like that, although they were not all Buddhists, because those universities also taught lay people and also taught people. They didn't, in those ancient days, they didn't really use the word Buddhism, Bauddha, that much. They used the Adhyatmika was one term, Nangba, as the Tibetans also still use that phrase, Nangba, an insider or an inner scientist, and then Sangha, they referred to the Buddhist community as Sangha, and Vihara, the Sangha Vihara were the monasteries and the universities. So the word Bauddha doesn't really come until quite later. But in that period, 400, 500 or so BCE to 400 or 500 CE, the learning and a lot of the writing and a lot of the development of thought is taking place in the Buddhist monastic universities. And that gap is a big gap in India's self-understanding. That was Clark's thesis, basically. And actually, he had some personality differences with his primary student, his superior student, who was Daniel Ingalls, who was my teacher, because somehow Ingalls didn't completely agree with Clark's view, and he precisely did not focus on Buddhist studies, Sanskrit Buddhist studies, and even a student such as me, who came already from a Tibetan interested side, he tried to encourage me to read non-Buddhist writings more. And he even once said to me, "How can you stand all this in that Buddhist literature? They were such a bunch of damn goodies," he said. The Buddhists. He said. So I said, "Well, Dan, although they may have been goodies, if you met one at night on the dark street or somewhere or in the wilderness, you would like to meet a goody, not a baddie," I said. And he laughed. And actually, after he retired, he kind of joined up in the Sanskrit Buddhism thing, where he used to have private readings when he was emeritus at Harvard. And some of his old students who were in the New England area where I was teaching in those days at Amherst College, And so occasionally I had some semesters of teaching at Harvard also, and he would hold readings at his apartment on the Charles River, and some of 10, 12 of us or something would gather from neighboring schools, and some of his graduate students, even advanced graduate students, would come, and he was reading the Divyavadana, and he started reading more Buddhist texts actually for some reason, and when he read them, he would sparkle with the beauty. I'll never forget the first one where I was particularly astonished, and then I made sure to go every time after that, where he read the Divya. He was reading in the Ashokavadana section of the Divyavadana, and it's where the Buddha meets Ashoka in a previous life of Ashoka. Shakyamuni does, as a little kid, and the little kid is playing in a sandbox, and so I won't tell the whole story, but he meets that. But anyway, there's a passage in the text where the Buddha puts his foot on the threshold of a city, the city where the previous life of Ashoka, according to the Avadana, was living. And the minute he put his foot on there, the blind could see, the cripples stood up, etc. And the light rays came out of his teeth, when he smiled. And it really, almost like a Bhakti literature from the Divya Avadana in Sanskrit. Really, really amazing. And the way that Professor Ingalls would light up when his imagination going with the Sanskrit to sort of see it as a vision, as a fantasy, perhaps, if you will, or a vision. He really liked it, so he would continue reading that eventually. But during his professional life, he did not much follow Clarke's injunctions, let's say. So I have about this treasury of Sanskrit Buddhism in Tibetan language, with Sanskrit-derived Tibetan language. I have an analogy for Indian scholars today who may wonder if it really is that important. And my analogy is Indiana Jones. Being American, I refer to Indiana Jones, the movie character. And Indiana Jones is walking around in Ethiopia looking to find some artifact to make money as a dealer, right, as an art finder. And he falls in a hole somewhere, and defies death, the way he always does. And then he finds himself in an underground enormous library with many, many volumes, and in Ethiopic language, along with some dictionaries and concordances and reference works. And then after some investigation, he robs a couple of copies and he runs off somewhere and has them evaluated. And then it becomes known that this is a complete set of translations of the most important works, all of them, of the Library of Alexandria, which was burnt in the 3rd century, as you know, by Clement, the Bishop Clement of Alexandria, who was a fanatic and who didn't like classical learning. That burning then reduced the number of codices, as they call them, of the ancient classical Mediterranean world in Aramaic, Greek, and Latin. It reduced them to only around 30,000 different copies, and whereas 30,000 different works or something, according to what's his name? I'm sorry, the Oxford scholar, a friend of mine, but I just can't remember his name right now. But anyway, according to him. And whereas, of course, the Indian literature in itself is millions of books, and the libraries of Nalanda and other such monasteries must have been in the hundreds of thousands. And so it's like that. Then in the Western Mediterranean, Euro-American sort of type scholars would just flip out over that, and there'd be a huge government thing and huge grants and lots of people learning to translate the works, and they would do a bang-up job of recovering the larger volume of the works of the Library of Alexandria within a few decades, I'm sure, and by putting huge manpower and funding and effort into it. So this Kanjur and Tenjur collections of translations from Sanskrit, mostly some Apabhramsha, some dialect, Prakrit languages, but mostly Sanskrit, almost entirely Sanskrit. This would create a huge literature that would fill the gap during the ascendancy of the Buddhist monastic universities, which you could count as almost 1,000 years, maybe 800 years or something. So it would really enrich the picture of like where bhakti came from, where different things like, Shankara, Gaudapada, you have the little clues like Gaudapada, for example, in his Mandukya Karika commentary, Mandukya Upanishad commentary, Mandukya Karika, he salutes in his parampara Buddha as well as, Badarayana and others. And in his elaboration of Vedanta, and he supposedly is the grand teacher of Shankara, some generations before him. And but no one knows the writing of the great, Buddha Palita. We know about Nagarjuna, but other Baba Viveka and people like that who wrote amazing works in Sanskrit were great. They were all Brahmins and well educated before they became Buddhist monks or Buddhist professors, and they wrote extraordinary works. So that's that analogy, and so that's what you have, and it's something that I hope in my emeritus years to put a lot of effort in, to spend time in India, and to hopefully with young Indian scholars and Tibetan scholars and people from Japan, China, from all over the world, to really try to restore into the modern languages, of course, but also into Sanskrit and Telugu and Tamil and these languages, so that the Indian education system and cultural scholarly system has access to its own treasures. Actually, this actually fits with. So in a way, it's adding a lost half. Again, now I want to refer also to my my dear friend, again late, sadly, Lalmani Joshi, who was the director of the Guru Gobind Singh World Religion Center in Patiala University for many years. And then he was shifting to Varanasi at one point, but sadly died on the way, many now 20, 30 years ago, but in the prime of his life and his career. And so we didn't have further works from him, but the work he did work, the studies in the classical Buddhistic civilization of India, or of classical India, Buddhist civilization of classic India. He then puts forth a thesis, I think, following his guru, G.C. Pandey of Gorakhpur University, and he said that the Hinduism is not to be thought of accurately as only coming from the Vedic strand, the Vedist strand, I could say, because there is another strand which he called the Shramanic strand, and the two currently existing main movements of that strand are the Jainism and Buddhism, of course, although then Sanskrit Buddhism got lost in India 1,000 years ago. But it still exists, of course, in Tibet and China and all over East Asia and in Sri Lanka and Burma and everywhere. But it got kind of lost to India. So but that Shramanic, the Jains luckily survived and persisted. But these two strands represent the other half of the contributing stream to the river, or the Ganga River of Hindu civilization or Hinduism. But the Shramanic one, and many of the things like nonviolence, like one guru in Mathura, at one of the centers there, he gave me a little instruction one afternoon a few years ago, and he said that he felt very grateful to Shakyamuni Buddha, of course, Vishnu's ninth avatar, for having stopped the blood sacrifices, the animal sacrifices, and so forth in ancient Vedic practice, and then he was critical of Tibetans because they're very carnivores. They do eat meat because of the way their economy was in Tibet. Although the Dalai Lama, perhaps in response to that guru's advice, because I took that message to the Dalai Lama, but maybe just himself anyway, had turned all the big Buddhist monasteries, monastic universities in South India and elsewhere, and they don't serve meat in the monasteries at all, and they don't buy meat, and they have no butcher, nothing there. They manage to live well as in veg with the veg diet. Monks are allowed, of course, to go off somewhere in town or something when on holidays or something, and maybe they can indulge their cultural Tibetan habit, but the monasteries don't do it. So anyway, Lal Mani Joshi, I found his thesis very persuasive, and other scholars like the Dutts and some of the Bhattacharyas and others, I think, might agree in some extent. But in that light, when you see the axial age in India, in the middle of the first millennium before the Common Era, you see the Buddhists and the Jains as really the more radical members of those introducing the concept of moksha into the Hindu stream. And then the Upanishads come along with that while trying to connect that back to the Vedas and the Brahmanas and the Aranyakas and so forth, which had been only a very thin vein in the main activist karma yoga, you could say, philosophy of the Vedas. And so the Jnana Yoga, the whole Jnana Yoga contribution is really more comes strongly from the Shramana line, and then finally in the Gita, as we all know, I mean, this is thumbnail for you, but just in relation to that, then he's the one who connects both karma yoga, jnana yoga, and bhakti yoga in the real final Hindu synthesis. But the jnana yoga component may well be due, and the credit may be due to the Shramana lineage, and to really understand the Indian scriptures of the Shramana lineage, the biggest body of them, you need to make this voyage to Tibet and recover that. And luckily, His Holiness the Dalai Lama considers it his fourth major aim of life. As a son of India, he calls himself son of Nalanda, sometimes he says, sometimes son of India, because he has been in India in exile by the generosity and kindness of Nehruji and all the Nehrujis, and then by the rest of the Indian population, since 1959, which makes it 62 years now. And he said, therefore, I have had more rice and dal than whatever Tibetan food I ate for my first 24 years. Because he's 85, so he's had 3/4 of his body is constituted by rice and dal. He says in a funny way. So anyway, as a son of India and son of Nalanda University, Monastic University, his fourth aim in life, after, as a human working for human beings, as a Buddhist working for better understanding amongst world religions, and as a Tibetan speaking up for the plight of the Tibetans under the Chinese genocidal policies, and as a son of India, Nalanda, his fourth aim is helping to bring back India's own mainstream inner sciences, the sort of complementary part of it, let's say. India, of course, the Shaddarshanas are the root of the Indian sciences, the Hindu side, you could call the Hindu sciences, but the real overall Indian sciences, where you have a pluralistic debate, Hindu, Buddhist, Jain, etc., whoever is there, in the wonderful Indian pluralism that the Dalai Lama so admires, along with its democracy, this Buddhist scriptural contribution, Sanskrit Buddhism, is a huge, huge contribution. And the Tibetans, therefore, he's wanted to do that, and some of them have trained in Sanskrit. He would love it, of course, if many more would institute curricula in Sanskrit in the long run in the Buddhist monastic universities in South India. That should be the case. I had a graduate student who had that ambition, actually, and he's young, but unfortunately he became ill. He wasn't really able to accomplish it so far, but someone will. So finally, so that's that. So then when you understand the Upanishads as interactive with the Jain and Buddhist movements, the Shramana movements, then you understand them better. And you understand the whole issue of moksha and jnana as a fourth ashrama, fourth aim of life, and of jnana yoga in the Gita. You understand its source better. And then the other element, which only more recently I've been thinking about, is if you know more of the Buddhist bodhisattva literature, the sort of devotionalist literature in Buddhism, we might find a contributing source to the marvelous Indian movements of bhakti. One of India's greatest contributions in world religions is the intense, passionate, devoted bhakti tradition, as a mass tradition, not just a few mystics, but a mass tradition. Like holidays like Holy, and and you know, festivals of light and festivals of color and things like that, and then the serious love of Shiva and love of Krishna and love of Rama. There's really bhakti thing, and how the Vedic deities were not exactly lovable. They were a little more rough and tough. There were no females basically except Prithvi, Mother Earth, and Ushas. That's about it in the Vedas. And not there weren't any important female deities. There were Savitri and other things, important female figures, but not deities. And yet now you suddenly get Shakti and Shiva and Uma and Meenakshi and all this thing. Where does all this bhakti, this devotion, and the idea that God loves you and you love God? And where does that love connection come from as a mass movement, not just a priestly movement? And where that comes could be the bodhisattva idea, after Ashoka and then after Nagarjuna, when Mahayana Sanskrit Buddhism starts to come up. Then that's where the bhakti may have an influence, or a contributing factor. Nobody's trying to claim total credit, but source credit. But you understand better the Bhagavatam and these kind of things and where they come from, and what influenced them. And finally, of course, in Hinduism, the theory of karma and the idea of being reborn according to what your ethical action is was a big innovation of the Shamanas, because in the Vedic cult, karma meant ritual action, because that was powerful action that affected your destiny, because the gods controlled your destiny in the pre-moksha Vedas, the early Vedas, the ritualistic ceremonial Vedas. And only later, at the time of the Shramana movements, in their own right, like Buddhism, Jainism, Ajivakism, etc., other ones that didn't last, and then codified also sort of orthodoxically in the Upanishads. There's no source for this loving business. Kings also don't love you. They have the danda. They beat you up. They have the divine right of kings. But after Ashoka, and after some of the Buddhist texts and Buddhists like the Aganya Sutta and the Mahasamata theory of kingship, for example, then you get these new contributions. And so the idea that the powerful karma is not ritual action, but is ethical action, that idea definitely has to be attributed to the Shramanas. So again, that literature is very valuable to understand that what I consider karma theory as elaborated by Buddha to be a kind of biological theory explaining the variety of living forms and living beings, kind of an ancient Indian Darwin theory, but one that is for the individual, not only for the species, for the individual, in their individual life and re-life and life and death and rebirth and then re-death and rebirth and re-death and rebirth. So that whole theory. So in early Upanishads, it's not so clear that everybody gets reborn except going to the ground of the ancestors, if you're lucky. Anyway, finally, the non-dual, as an individual, in other words. Finally, the non-dualism in philosophy and science and the revaluation of the body as deeply key to spiritual evolution, and thus the source of Tantra, and thus the emergence of Tantra as the neurological science and contemplative art of accelerating spiritual and physical evolution toward human enlightenment emerged also from the Mahayana Sanskrit culture and needs us to know something about that culture. So anyway, in that culture, the 5 sciences, and this is germane to the idea, which is alive in India, but not necessarily yet very effectively implemented, which is the reconstruction and the restoration of India, one of the jewels of classical India, which was the Nalanda Monastic University. And there has been a move to make a new Nalanda University as a worldwide center, not only for Buddhists, but as a great university. And people have worked on it. There have been pros and cons about it. But actually, it would have to go back to the core curriculum of the Sanskrit Buddhism. And in that, Adhyatma Vidya becomes the king of all sciences. That's like psychology and philosophy. Then Hetu Vidya, that's a logic, epistemology, and the rules of debate. That's very important for learning. Shabda Vidya, grammar, of course, and then multi-language grammar that is involved in the pluralistic India. Chikitsa Vidya, so medicine, but a mind-body type of medicine that allowed for mind, not like modern materialist sciences, what I call industrial medicine. And then finally, the engineering and architecture and arts, Shilpasthana Vidya. These are the ancient five sciences of the great monastic universities and so on. And there are many works in all of those fields, not just in Buddhist doctrines and so on, in that collection. And so anyway, that's my talk. I think that's long enough, maybe too long. It's been about 45 minutes. And I shared these ideas with you, and on the basis of the pages of notes that I made. And I could talk for a long time about all the monastic university system based on the works of your own great Dutt, the family of the Dutts, the different Dutts, and the Bhattacharyas and the other great Indian scholars who have traced that history, and would be delighted to do so. But this is just my brief talk on this topic, and in which also I am announcing an intention I have with a charitable foundation partner in India and an Indian Buddhist monk to develop a center to really intensify and get worldwide support and Indian government support for both state and federal to really put this in high gear and to really restore this literature en masse. And I was charged with this. I won't be able to get much more done. I did a few books myself in my life, in my scholarly life, but only a very few. There are thousands to do, and it's a wonderful scholarly field. So I hope younger scholars, if any of them happen to hear this talk or be at this conference, that they might consider looking into that, learn Tibetan and learn Buddhist Sanskrit, and look into the treasures of Sanskrit Buddhism as found in the Kangyur and Dengyur collections that are printed actually in Tibetan Buddhist monasteries, and there are copies of them all over the world in different universities by now and so on. Okay, so thank you very much, Pankaj and friends, and I hope this will be useful bringing this perspective to you. Thank you very much.